Welcome to this month's Journal Club episode. I'm really excited that you're here. I found this article in the Science Daily postings and I was immediately drawn to it because I am one of many, many, many adults who have that adult ADHD diagnosis, right? And I've been, looking at it from different angles and trying to decide what to do with it. And most days it gives me a lot more empathy for myself, which is awesome, right? Instead of being like, wow, I'm a terrible person because I cannot sit there and do deep work on a schedule for 3 hours a day, which is going to make me really, really successful. And I know this because of a white man wrote a book about it. It instead gives me a lot of grace and understanding about myself. Says, hey, sometimes I do lock in and that's awesome and I love it. And sometimes I'm a little bouncy. I'm all over the place. So today's article is the role of psychological strengths and positive life outcomes in adults with ADHD in the journal Physiological Medicine. And the lead author is Luca Hargitai, who is a PhD student at University of Bath. She's absolutely lovely, so generous to come on the podcast. Her voice is amazing. I'm sure someone out there who has better editing skills than I do, you should just take her voice, edit all of my annoying American voice out and just focus on hers because it's just, it is a delight. And she is a delight and her work is so cool. And I'm so glad that there are people in the world out there who care about questions like this, who want to make sure that everyone of every background is successful. Let's dive in. Wonderful. Well, thank you for being on the podcast, Luca Hargitai. I think I got close to your name, probably not quite right, but you can correct me if you would. Yeah,
No,
let the world know.
I think it's great. It's a
Okay,
tricky.
all right. So we were chatting just a little bit before I hit record, and you're currently a PhD student at the University of Bath. And I'll admit, I'm in the United States. I have a vague sense of like United States geography, and it gets a lot worse as soon as I get outside of the United States. So where is Bath in the UK?
So it's in the southwest of England. It's quite close to Bristol, which is, I guess, maybe a more well-known city nearby. It's very pretty. It's got lots of Georgian buildings. If you have ever watched Bridgerton, a lot of the initial season was filmed in Bath, so you might recognize some iconic locations in Bath. And we have a lovely university that's up on the top of a very steep hill. Fairly new university for British standards. I think it's sort of 60-ish years old. Um, but yeah, the research, especially in psychology, is going strong at Bath.
Nice. Yeah, that's a great setting the scene. I haven't watched Bridgerton, but my mother does, and she listens to this podcast, so she'll be very excited. I'm sure other people will too. And that's funny you mentioned at the top of the hill. So where I went to school and now I work in Fort Collins, Colorado, it's really, really flat. Like we're right next to the Rocky Mountains, but we're basically on the plains, and there's one kind of big hill-ish in the town. I mean, there's more than one, but it feels like there's one, and my building was on top of it as a point of pride to bike in every day that I could in my PhD. And that hill, every time, people would even tell me later, like, Anna, it always looks like you were suffering. I'm like, I was getting up that hill.
Yeah, for me, it's an equivalent of I try to walk in most days and I get to the office and all of my fellow PhD students and some postdocs are always looking at me like, are you okay? At a point of pride of cardio fitness in the morning.
Exactly. All of my offices now are on the third floors of buildings. So I'm just like, well, it's good for me, I suppose. So we're talking about your paper in psychology, the Journal of Psychology Medicine, called "The Role of Psychological Strengths in Positive Life Outcomes in Adults with ADHD." Long title that tells us a whole lot of information out the gate. But you're working on your PhD in psychology, so maybe just taking a step back, how did you get into psychology in the first place?
So pinpointing the exact moment I decided to go down the path of psychology is quite tricky. I think back and I can't quite determine when, but the way the UK education system works is we've got our sort of high school is up until year 11, and then at that point we do some exams and we then go to something called sixth form, which is 2 extra years of education, and that is to prepare us for university. So at that point, somewhere I decided I wanted to study psychology for A level, which is what we do at sixth form, and then to apply to study psychology at university. And I was really interested in mental health and I was really interested in clinical psychology. So I did my undergraduate degree in experimental psychology, and in my final year, where we could pick options and modules that we could sort of pick between, definitely went more down the clinical route. And then I decided I was keen to stay in the realm of clinical psychology, so I did a master's in applied clinical psychology here at Bath. And that's where I met my current supervisor because he supervised me on my dissertation project, Dr. Punit Shah. And that's how I got into my sort of current research area. I did a project with him where we were looking at the links between autism and ADHD and mental health, and sort of comparing traits of autism and ADHD and how well they predict mental health, specifically symptoms of anxiety and depression. And interestingly, we found that ADHD was more predictive of poor mental health than autism was at the trait level. So that was very exciting. And at the time, I was still very set on going down more of the vocational clinical psychology side of things. So I ended up working in a mental health setting for a year, but I really enjoyed research. So at the end of that master's year, I had already gotten a job in London at a mental health service. So I knew I was doing that for a year, but I told my supervisor, you know what, I want to do a PhD. So then sort of stayed within the realm of ADHD research. And my PhD is just focusing on improving our understanding of ADHD across the lifespan, but a particular focus on adults. And it's links to mental health, it's links to other conditions. And throughout this process, I sort of stumbled upon this area of strengths in ADHD. So I do a little bit of everything, is what I feel.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Maybe just sort of a, beginner question, but is there a difference between experimental psychology and clinical psychology? You throw out kind of several terms tied to psychology. Like, what are the differences?
So I think in terms of my undergraduate degree, it was called experimental psychology because it was the content of the course had a lot of focus on different aspects of psychological research. We had some lectures that we were looking at things that were more neuroscience based, others were more pure sort of social psychology, but there was a heavy focus on us doing research ourselves. We had practical labs where we collected data or we analyzed data and we wrote those up as lab reports. And our dissertation project was very sort of research focused. I think in terms of the name experimental psychology, that doesn't necessarily differ from a standard psychology undergraduate degree. And here in the UK, most of these degrees will be accredited by the British Psychological Society. And that is actually a prerequisite to then be able to go on to practice as a psychologist, for example, as a clinical psychologist or as a health psychologist. But of course, that requires further training. But then in terms of my master's, that was in applied clinical psychology. That was much more heavily focused on the clinical side of things, looking at mental health, learning about different forms of therapy. It wasn't a vocational course, so it wasn't training us to be therapists, but it was giving us a very good theoretical background to all of that.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So is the flow through, again, trying to just organize this all in my mind, is the flow through from, research to actual someone is sitting and getting information that's going to help them, right? Is the flow through that the sort of experimental psychologists are more figuring out what are the tools, the methods that seem to be effective, and then more vocational people are applying them? Is that more or less how it works?
Sort of, yeah. So I guess even if it's not experimental psychologists, you'll have people who sit between the two where they are researchers and also they practice as clinical psychologists. But there are people who do more research and teaching and people who just do clinical practice. Um, and I guess the way it works within psychology and it works the same way in medicine is there is research that investigates the effectiveness of certain therapies or treatments, and then that is used to inform guidance for therapists or guidance for doctors in clinical practice. So typically you'd have people who are much more theoretical, and those are more detached from the I guess the therapy application side of things. So you might have some psychologists who research things that have nothing to do with therapy, nothing to do with mental health, nothing to do with sort of practical, tangible, population-based interventions. They might be just very interested in how we perceive the world. They might be interested in sort of how social groups are formed. But then you have people who are quite interested in more applied research. So I'm on the more applied side, I would say, but I do not I sort of do more of the in between the theory and the actual testing of interventions side of things, more trying to disentangle the relationships between interesting variables. So understanding how ADHD relates to mental health and understanding things that are relevant to the conceptualization of ADHD in adulthood. So what are, for example, as the paper that we will be discussing, what are strengths that are likely to be tied to ADHD? And then that will then need to be taken by people and I guess assessed more formally in an intervention. Does this actually work before it can be widely applied? So while it's really exciting, our findings that there, and a bit of a spoiler, that there are certain things that seem to be more endorsed by adults with ADHD than those without ADHD in terms of strengths. We can't take our paper and say, okay, now we can go into clinical practice and tell people that these are definite ADHD strengths and we need to use these strengths to improve mental health. We've got an indication of those mechanisms there, but it needs more formal testing and it needs to be validated within an intervention before it can be applied.
That makes sense. And then I feel like I'm quizzing you for like an exam or something, but is there a functional difference between a psychologist and a therapist?
So I think psychologist is a term that encapsulates people who do research as well as people who do therapy. Um, In the UK, there have been recent movements to make certain terms protected and require there to be professional registries the way there is with, say, doctor or medical doctor. Um, but I'm not quite sure where we are with that at the moment. But I think there are certain terms that are very specific. So, a clinical psychologist is someone who has a doctor in clinical psychology and they have been trained in several aspects of therapy. Most training centers will include CBT as one of those, and then they'll have alternative therapies as well. And they can call themselves doctors and they are trained therapists. Then there are people who are trained in specific types of therapy. So I have training in low intensity cognitive behavioral interventions, and I work to something called a psychological wellbeing practitioner. So that's another route into therapy. There are people who are counselors and go through counseling training, but it's quite tricky to, I guess, say that there is one such thing as psychologists, because you could argue that the people who research things like, I don't know, visual perception or people who research social psychology or they might research, I don't know, how we gosh, I can't think of another example, but environmental psychology, sort of how we relate to our physical environment and our sort of views towards climate change. All of those people could be called psychologists, but they won't necessarily be therapists.
Okay. Yeah. All right. That makes sense. I mean, I've heard these terms for years and I never really understood the difference. So this was a really helpful kind of laying out the land. I think maybe the furthest I ever got was sort of psychiatrists could prescribe medications and psychologists could not, but that's, I think, the only functional thing I've learned about the difference. So you hinted at this a little bit, but your paper is on ADHD adults. And looking through your publication records, you've been on papers, you've led papers also looking at, say, autism and perhaps other neurodivergence traits like OCD. Was there a particular pull to this field in general? Was it more just you liked the advisor? How did you kind of get into this neurodivergence realm?
Yeah, it's actually yeah, it is quite a lot to do with my supervisor. I guess you call them advisors.
Yeah.
Because he is an autism researcher and he did his PhD research in something called prosopagnosia and also autism. So prosopagnosia sometimes is referred to as face blindness. But
Isn't that
I
the famous thing that like Oliver Sacks had or something? Just as a, yeah,
Yes,
okay.
I don't know much about it, but it is a very interesting area. And so I was really interested in mental health. That's how I came to that applied clinical psychology master's. And then through the process of picking dissertation projects, I sort of ended up doing my dissertation with him. And he was much more of an autism researcher than mental health researcher. So we found something that was a little bit of both. And as I mentioned, I would then went on to work at a mental health service where I was helping adults with low mood and anxiety and specific phobias, things like that. So I was still very much interested in mental health. But it was through sort of working with my supervisor and that broader lab group, who are a dream team, in my opinion. That's how I sort of got into the realm of sort of neurodiversity research, and that's where sort of my PhD is situated. But I feel like I am sort of a dabbler in a lot of different things. That's sort of my research interest, but then I've got a broader interest in meta research or meta science and something called open science, which I think is quite a common topic within the realm of psychology, but it's maybe a little bit less talked about in other fields, and that's sort of talking about and doing things to make science more open, accessible, more transparent and rigorous. So that's sort of something that I do on the side. And I tried to sort of infuse that within my research itself. For example, with this paper that we're talking about, we've got the study that was pre-registered, so we sort of thought about what we wanted to do before we set out to do the study. So we've got that recorded. We've got our data set that is open. So if people are interested and they want to have a look at the data, if they want to do research using our data, it's all open on the Open Science Framework, and that's linked through our study, our paper, so people can find that. We've got our code that we used to analyze our data as well, so people can take a look at it. And it's all about being transparent in what we do. Um, but yeah, in terms of going back to your question of neurodiversity research, I think it's a really interesting and very fast evolving area. And I think it has a very heavy focus on sort of listening to the community and what they are interested in, the researchers looking into, more so than maybe some other fields. And I think this is why the area of sort of neurodivergent strengths, or in my case, ADHD related strengths, is really interesting, because I've had such positive feedback from the community that they are really liking the fact that we are pointing to these positive qualities that can be associated with ADHD.
Amazing. Yeah, there's so many good threads in there that I mean I could spend hours on, but maybe I just want to highlight again for people listening that you said some key things about like you came into something where you found people you wanted to work with. So you found like your dream team, which I think a lot of people who maybe did like an undergrad in science or thinking about going back to school or whatever it may be, they might kind of be like, well, I don't really know what I want to research. And that sort of feels like this big blocker. And sometimes it's more like, can you find somewhere you'd be excited to live? Can you find somewhere you like people you'd be excited to work with? Like I had two major choices between my grad school, and it was in Utah, the state where I'm from in the United States, and Colorado, where I am now. And and then the research would have been in the same broad field, kind of atmospheric science, but like very different. I honestly don't even remember what the Utah option would have been. It was something kind of weathery related. And I'm like, I don't understand the weather, but I would have if I had gone in that direction. So it wasn't that I was just so blown away by the research either one had to offer me. I was just like, no, I'm kind of vibing better with this person. I'm vibing better with this area. And I, like you, I'm a dabbler. I can convince myself to get excited about a whole lot of different things. So I'm just like, I'd rather like optimize on other levels of my quality of life. A couple other really interesting things you said. One was that your study had been pre-registered. Could you explain that a little bit more? I'm not familiar with that style of.
I sort of sometimes forget all the jargon that I
Yeah.
use. Do sort of problem from that if I do that. So pre-registration is this idea that I guess maybe I'll take a step back. So there was this big reproducibility crisis within psychological research, within medicine, within biology. I am not sure to what extent it was in other scientific fields and other STEM subjects, but in psychology it was quite a big problem where there were these classic classic studies that just did not replicate. So there are some pop psychology ones like if you power pose, it will make you feel more confident and do better at interviews. Not the case.
Yeah.
But it's not a reproducible finding. Um, or that if you force yourself to smile, it can make you feel better. And in some ways, it might help a little bit, but it's not a consistent, robust finding.
Mhm.
And that's the case with a lot of psychological research. So we came to this thing which we termed the reproducibility crisis. So essentially, research was just not replicable. So along came some people who thought about ways we could get past that. And there were other issues of p-hacking, which I'm sure many of the listeners will also be familiar with, of we didn't quite find what we wanted to find, but what if we just run some more tests and then by
Hmm.
chance find some positive results and we can get it published?
Yep.
Or the factual problem of there being null results and it's treated as negative rather than null, so we're just gonna axe that. We're not gonna try and publish it, and that sort of creates this issue of inflated effect sizes within the literature, and then meta-analyses are also off because they are based on these published results, but then a lot of the file drawed ones that are sort of null results aren't considered within these meta-analyses. So I can go on. So essentially, there was a big crisis in psychological research. And one of the things that people said would be important is, and especially to stop people p-hacking and sort of hypothesizing after the fact, is to get people to pre-register. So what that means is you think of your, and this is how research should work. You think of your aims, your research questions, your hypotheses, and your, I guess, your methodology. You work that out. You think about the sample size you might need. And I know that in other areas of scientific research, samples mean very different things. But for us, it means the number of people that we will recruit and will take part in our survey study, in our experiment. And that can be determined by, it could be the amount of resources we actually have and how much we can pay in participant compensation. So we tend to pay participants to reimburse them for their time spent on the study. It might be limited by that. But then if we are able to power it in terms of statistical power, so essentially minimizing the chance that we will find a null effect when there is an effect. And then bigger samples will also help us detect effects that we're interested in. So essentially, we want to say before we even set off to do the study, how many participants we'll recruit, how we will collect the data, what our analysis plans are, what our hypotheses are, what our main research question is, and sort of setting that groundwork. And then we go away, collect the data, and run our study in that way, and we analyze it in the way that we set out to analyze it. So those are pre-registered analyses, and if there's something that's really interesting that comes up, we can still follow that on and do a bit more analyses, but those are flagged as exploratory analyses.
Okay.
Some exploratory analyses in this paper, which essentially we looked at initially comparing the two groups in the extent to which they endorsed a list of 25 psychological strengths that a previous bit of research that was done by some of my colleagues on this paper identified as potential ADHD strengths. And initially, we just compared them using t-tests, the extent to which they endorsed these strengths, the ADHD and the non-ADHD group. But then one of my supervisors on the paper, Dr. Martina Hugman, had this idea of, okay, we've also compared the number of number of strengths that each of these groups endorsed, but how about we compare the number of people who endorsed each of the strengths? So it's a slightly different way of looking at the same question. So we've got that within this paper as well, which we flagged as an exploratory analysis. So that's one way of doing it. And also, while it can be really, really scary putting your ideas out there and sort of pre-registering your study, I guess some people might have the question of, okay, but what if I have to change things because there were things that I just didn't consider or things I didn't foresee? That is absolutely fine. It's just about being transparent about it.
Mhm.
So it's something is different. You just make it explicitly clear in your manuscript that it was pre-registered, but you had to deviate for this reason and in this way. So, for example, we pre-registered collecting data from the same amount of males as females, but I think because of the nature of online data collection and the way that we were collecting data, it was not possible. So it was, while the two groups were matched in the sort of the gender distribution, it wasn't sort of equal amount of males and females in our sample. So that's just something that we flagged. Um, and then another thing that could come up is, okay, I pre-registered my study, but if it's out there, people might scoop me,
Hmm.
which is a very valid concern. But actually, what's very nice about a lot of these servers where you can pre-register your study is that you can make it private and then you can do your research and then you can make it public and link it to your paper. So that's just one way of doing open research. But some people might have work that's really exploratory and it's just at the very, very start of a field and you don't really have any real hypotheses that you can base on past research. So at that point, you might think, okay, well, I don't really know what to pre-register, but other aspects of open research are making your data open so that people can have a look themselves, making your analysis code open. And I know that's actually quite common practice with things like physics, where people just put things on archive and there's loads of data that's available, loads of code that's just normally shared, say on GitHub. So it's a very common practice, and they might not realize that they are doing open research.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. It's I've never heard of pre-registering in my fields, and right now, I'm a professor in engineering, systems engineering, and so most of my students are systems engineers. So, and I'm actually I'm co-teaching a course right now that I'm learning so much out of because I'm not an engineer by background or training. And so the course is literally research methods for PhD students in our program. And this is a class that I wish I had taken probably not my first year of grad school, but my second year of grad school, because it's so comprehensive and like research doesn't need to be a mystery, but something that the professor I'm co-teaching with, who's the department head and has been around for quite a while and has thought about these things a lot, is he does try to highlight sort of the differences between a more pure, scientific hypothesis, scientific method research and engineering research. They're not necessarily the same thing, but there's still no reason why we couldn't be, if not publicly pre-registering, we could still be kind of like doing this process in our group, like within ourselves. And listeners might also find this appealing, this idea of like kind of going through that rigor of, I don't have any time, to be quite honest, to do research anymore. I just tell other people to do research. But when I did do research, it always felt a little bit like fly by the seat of my pants. I'm like, okay, my boss told me, my advisor, supervisor, whoever told me to go run this model because I did a lot of modeling. So run this model and change these variables. And I would have sort of like a vague concept of like, I bet this is going to happen when I change these variables, but I never articulated it. So that actual rigor of articulation, it has to make you a better researcher, better scientist, better at thinking through things, and kind of gives you that pre-planning rather than just sort of like a chaotic, like, okay, we'll see what happens next. So I think that's super cool. So I'm hoping that I can take some of this rigor into my group, and then other people might also find it really interesting. Um, so in the paper, this is sort of a silly question, but in the title, right, the role of psychological strengths. Can you define psychological strengths? I have a vague concept, but let's make it crystal clear.
In our paper, we defined this as something that you do well or best, which can seem quite vague, but I guess it is sort of a very subjective thing of what do you consider to be your strength. So we thought, okay, previous research had defined it as something that a person does well or best, so we went with that. Um, and that's how we actually asked people to rate their endorsement of these 25 strengths. Is this something, or to what extent do you feel that this is something that you do well or best? And they rated it on a scale of 1 to 7, where it's a 1, I think it was not at all, and 7 was completely, or something along those lines. I can't quite remember the exact anchors, but they were given these anchors for the rating. And then we used a cutoff of 5. So if they rated something as 5 or more, we said, okay, they are endorsing it as a personal strength. But yeah, as something that they do well or best.
Okay, that makes sense. And then right away in your introduction, you start outlining, psychological strengths tied to ADHD has not really been explored. There's lots of openings for deepening this research. So is this project, is it kind of building upon stuff that your group has already done, or is it just fairly new for your group?
So, my group was much more focused on autism research, and when I joined, and I've got a colleague, Jola Lainka, and she does more a mixture of autism and ADHD, and I feel like I do more ADHD than autism research. So we're sort of the ones that brought in a little bit more ADHD into the group. But a previous PhD student of my supervisors, Dr. Emily Taylor, she looked at strengths in autism, and essentially this paper that we did in ADHD was based on that autism paper that explored this same question. What are autistic strengths? To what extent do autistic adults know of or aware of their strengths, and to what extent do they use them in their daily lives, and how does this knowledge and this use of these strengths impact their well-being? And those were the questions we had for ADHD as well. So I feel like autistic strengths or that topic is a little bit more explored than it is in ADHD. But at the same time, a lab in the Netherlands at Radboud University Medical Center, led by Dr. Martina Hugman, were also interested in the positive aspects of ADHD. So Martina and her students and her postdocs have been researching sort of more of the positive side of ADHD for a while, and it was a quite a nice sort of chance collaboration, and we have collaborated since, and will hopefully continue to collaborate on this sort of research area. But they are interested in the positive aspects of ADHD. A lot of Martina's research and one of her current PhD students, they've looked at creativity, which is talked about and I think is the most researched ADHD related strength. There's quite a lot of quantitative studies looking at creativity and showing that in general, children, adolescents, adults with ADHD tend to perform better on tasks of creativity and divergent thinking. So divergent thinking is more thinking in unconventional ways, whereas creativity is coming up with innovative solutions to problems. So one task to measure that, for example, is the alternative uses task. So you're given something like a newspaper or a brick or a shoe, and you're asked to list within a time limit, I think it's 2 minutes, alternative uses for that. And adults with ADHD tend to perform better than adults without ADHD. And you can think about how, I guess, if you've got a neurodivergent mind, you are thinking of unconventional things more so than if you're neurotypical. So they had been researching this area for a while, and then we sort of collaborated because Nessa Skippers, who's also a co-author on the paper, she authored a big qualitative study first unpicking the potential ADHD strengths. So that was a study of, I think, 203 Dutch adults, and they surveyed them and asked them to talk about their experiences of ADHD, the positive and the negative. And they identified a whole range of strengths that fell into one of five themes. And we derived our list of 25 potential ADHD related strengths from that paper. So while there had been sort of growing interest in ADHD related strengths, the quantitative research was limited mostly to creativity, and a lot of the samples were either fairly small, or they were underpowered, or they had issues where they didn't account for certain things that are covariates like socioeconomic status, or even things like sex or gender, or age that could impact performance, or they might not have consistently accounted for that. So there was that sort of limitation in the literature, and there were some qualitative studies. So those are looking at more the lived experiences of people with ADHD that hinted at a different set of strengths, or in addition to creativity. So those could be things like being highly energetic, being spontaneous, being driven, things like that. But they were still fairly small scale, a couple of people being interviewed. And then Martina Hugman, Lessa Skibbers, and a few of their colleagues did this larger scale study that was qualitative and suddenly we had a better understanding of potential ADHD related strengths. But to our knowledge, our paper is the first one to actually quantify strengths in ADHD. So to actually look at it from a quantitative perspective and actually compare groups of adults with and without ADHD to understand, okay, so we talk about these things as potential ADHD strengths, but to what extent are they actually more recognized by people with ADHD? It could be that they are just as recognized by adults without ADHD. So at that point, is it an ADHD strength? Is it more of a general strength? So that's what one of the questions we were trying to answer.
Yeah, that's a great, history of the whole timeline. And then, as you say, the study was the first big quantitative study, and you had 400 recruits, 200 that identified with ADHD, 200 that identified without ADHD. That sounds like a large number and challenging to get that many people. So how was that recruitment done? I noticed there was a platform called Prolific that was mentioned. Is it something kind of third-party platform just doing all the recruiting for you guys?
Yes, so the way it works is we sort of create our survey or our online experiment in whatever software we work with, and then we recruit through Prolific. So we can have an academic account and essentially post studies on there, and they do verify people, so they are meant to be better at I guess weeding out fake accounts or bots. But it's an ever-growing sort of concern in online research, obviously with the sophistication of technology, but we can be fairly confident that we did get real people. And they also are really, really good at asking the participants a range of questions, or people, prolific users, sorry, a range of questions to help them categorize people. So then you can apply certain filters. So we wanted to look at people just in the UK. So people who were adults and people who lived in the UK. That's the population we were interested in. So we were able to filter based on that. They've got a brilliant feature, which if you're looking at a general population sample, you can actually make it nationally representative. So you can make it nationally representative by the UK and the USA. I'm not quite sure about other countries, but based on census data. And then that means that your sample is more, or the findings that you get from your sample is quite more easily generalizable to the broader population. But we were interested in adults with and without ADHD, so we weren't looking at a nationally representative sample in ours. Um, but it also had a feature where you are within the About You section when people sign up to Prolific, you complete, like I said, a whole range of questions, including diagnoses that people have. So when we were initially advertising our study, we were filtering people based on whether or not they had indicated they had ADHD. And then we did a pre-screening ourselves to verify diagnoses as well, with a range of questions, and then verified it further with their scores on the adult ADHD self-report scale. So we can be fairly confident that we had an ADHD group and a non-ADHD group. And that was quite handy because it made the process of recruitment a lot quicker, a lot simpler for us. Whereas if we were collecting data from this many people in the lab, it would have taken us months and months and months to collect. So I do think there are lots of benefits to using platforms like Prolific, collecting data online. And while people can say, like, yes, there is a very specific group of people who would be um, taking part in online research, I could also say the same thing about lab-based studies. If I were collecting data in Bath, there would be a very specific demographic of people who would be nearby enough to come in and take part in my study. And also, that might be sort of travel restrictions, and also the kind of people who are able to go outside and take part in studies. So I think there are definitely benefits and drawbacks to all methods within psychological research. It's just important to acknowledge them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a brilliant tie into industry because it's, as you say, you could have done this recruitment yourself. It would have taken months. And unless your research is on more effective recruiting, was it really worth your time, right? Like your research, your skills are so valuable in what you're doing to lose a year of time just to recruit is silly when there's things like this out there. So I was very excited to see that that was an option because I don't do polling type research, but I've always thought, man, it's got to take forever to get people signed up. And yeah, so that makes sense. And And so, the key findings for the paper, I'd love for you to share kind of what you found most exciting, most surprising.
So I think firstly, so we had three main questions. Firstly, what are ADHD related strengths? So what are the things that are more endorsed by people with ADHD versus those without ADHD? Secondly, we were interested in whether or not adults with and without ADHD differed in the extent to which they were aware of their strengths. So this is something we called strengths knowledge, and the extent to which they use their strengths in their daily lives. So that's strengths use. The first one, I think it was really interesting that we found 10 strengths that were actually more endorsed by the ADHD group than the non-ADHD group. So those are things like creativity, hyperfocus, being up for anything, being spontaneous, being intuitive. And out of that, what was really interesting was that hyperfocus was the one that was had the most evidence for being more endorsed by the ADHD group versus the non-ADHD group. Um, so that was where the biggest difference lied between the groups. But then if we look at the top five most endorsed by the ADHD group, it's actually, and I have it written down so I don't forget, it's humor, followed by empathy, then being inquisitive, then being resourceful, and then being intuitive. So those were the top five strengths. And contrary to what we expected, creativity was not even a top five strength. So the literature would have you believe that creativity is a big, big ADHD related strength. And yes, it is a strength. It was more endorsed by the ADHD group. And when you look at the mean sort of extent of endorsement, the mean score was above 5. So it is endorsed as an ADHD strength. But given the focus on creativity, you'd expect it to be more endorsed. So I think that was a particularly interesting finding. And then one strength was actually more endorsed by, or one potential strength was more endorsed by the non-ADHD group, and that was perseverance. So we had 10 more endorsed by the ADHD group, one by the non-ADHD group. So that left us with 14 that were actually similar between the two groups. So one interesting one is empathy. That was within the top five strengths for the ADHD group. So the top five most endorsed traits, but it was actually not more endorsed by the ADHD group than the non-ADHD group. So it might be a strength in both groups. And another interesting thing about this is that we were, like I mentioned earlier, trying to do a similar investigation that was previously done in autism. And there they didn't actually find many autistic strengths or strengths that are specific to autism, whereas we actually found quite a lot of evidence for a range of strengths that could be specific to ADHD. And of course, this is based on self-report. So now it would be really interesting to look at it in a more objective way. And yes, we've got existing measures for creativity, so that's fine. And some things like um, I don't know, being sort of imaginative and having broad interest, those are a little bit more tangible. You can sort of measure them quantitatively. But things like humor, that's such a subjective thing. So I'm not quite sure how you would design a study to measure that in an objective way. But that's a future direction for research. And then sort of the second question was, okay, do adults with ADHD and those without ADHD differ in the extent to which they know their strengths, so they're aware of having strengths and how much they use them? And the answer is no, they don't differ, which again is interesting because autistic adults in that study by Taylor et al. um, were actually they showed lower strengths knowledge and lower strengths use. So we didn't find that there was, I guess, like a difficulty with this or an impairment in this within the ADHD group. So that's really exciting because then we went on to find that across both groups, so irrespective of diagnostic status, both strengths knowledge and strengths use were linked to better well-being in adulthood. So for strengths knowledge, it was linked to better quality of life across the physical, psychological, environmental, and social domains, better subjective well-being, and lower levels of symptoms of depression, stress, and anxiety. Whereas for strengths use, it was more particular. So it was better well-being, better physical, psychological, and social quality of life, and less depression symptoms, but it wasn't a significant effect for the other life outcomes. But essentially, what we're finding here is that you could potentially harness strengths-based approaches to then improve well-being. But circling back to what I said at the beginning of this interview, this is a sort of a theoretical level investigation. We are looking at the relationship between variables. This now needs to be actually sort of tested in an intervention to see if this would be effective. But it's quite an exciting finding and lots of potential ways to take it.
I mean, that's a tremendous overview. I don't even need to add comments, but a couple of things I will add for better or for worse. One is there were tons of statistics in the paper, which first read through, I didn't even blink an eye at, right? We do lots of stats in what I do. And then thinking about it later, letting the brain just sort of letting the paper spin around in my brain, was like, I bet a lot of people are a bit surprised that they find out like you're doing psychology research, but it's really a lot of like statistical analysis. Do you get that sort of surprise from people, or are people kind of like, yes, this makes sense. I understand what psychology research is?
Yeah, I think because I am surrounded by so many other psychology researchers, I think it just feels really second nature to most of us. Though I will say there are some of my colleagues who do purely qualitative research. So that's when they interview people or do these long form surveys and they analyze it in very different ways. So they don't put numbers to their research. But for me, it does feel I am very much a quantitative researcher. So it does feel very natural to have so many stats in our paper. But what I do want to say is that we are looking at these questions in two ways. So we looked at it in the classic null hypothesis significance testing frequentist way, where we were looking at p-values, but we also supplemented that with some Bayesian statistics, which we do sort of explain a little bit more in our supplementary materials for anyone interested in the value of that. But essentially, it's really valuable when you've got null findings to understand the extent of the evidence for the null hypothesis. Because when we've got, sorry, did you want
Oh,
to?
yeah, just to remind the audience what a null finding, a null hypothesis is.
Yeah, so essentially, a null hypothesis is that there is no effect or there is no difference between groups. There's no association between variable A and variable B. And the alternative hypothesis, or H1, that is that there is an effect, there is a difference, there is an association. So when you are doing null hypothesis significance testing, you will set an alpha value, so that's your critical value for your significant, a critical level of significance. And in psychology, it tends to be 0.05. In medicine, it will often be lower. You want the margin of error to be very, very, very small, for example, in clinical trials for different medicines. But essentially, what we find is, or what we do is we look at the p-values that we achieve with our statistical analyses, and if they are below that critical alpha, so less than 0.05, then that will be considered evidence for the alternative hypothesis. So there is an effect, there is a difference, there is an association. If it is 0.05 or above, then we have an indication that it's a null effect. But what Bayesian statistics can help us determine is the extent of the evidence for the alternative versus the null hypothesis, or the null versus the alternative. So we get this thing called the Bayes factor, and the magnitude of that Bayes factor tells us the magnitude of the evidence in either direction. So if the Bayes factor is 1, then we don't have evidence in either direction. But the smaller it gets, it's between 0 and 1, the smaller it gets, the more evidence there is for the null hypothesis. And between 1 and infinity, the larger it gets, the more evidence for the alternative hypothesis. So when I mentioned earlier that hyperfocus had the strongest evidence for the difference, that's because the Bayes factor was really, really, really high, indicating there's strong evidence that there is a significant difference between the groups. Whereas when we look at the lack of a difference in strengths knowledge and strengths use, we can use the Bayes factor to quantify how much we can be confident in that the fact that there is no difference between the groups. So that's something that we did that not all psychological research will do that, and this is a technique that we've used before as well when we were looking at the relationship between autistic ADHD traits and mental health, and did find consistent evidence for ADHD traits being more predictive of worse mental health. Um, So that's just, I guess, maybe something that's a bit more surprising in terms of our stats.
Yeah, I mean we use a little bit of Bayesian well, I don't personally, but there's a student in my group who's excited about Bayesian statistics. She's applied it for a few things, and then there's whole people, not whole people, I'm phrasing this very poorly, but there's people who spend a lot of their time in their research on Bayesian statistics, and this is for, emissions of, say, methane or natural gas from the oil and gas supply chain, right? Which completely different field, but it's always fun to kind of, go completely outside your field, read another paper and be like, oh, I can hang because I know what, more or less you're doing. And so this isn't a mystery, right? We all can collaborate a little more closely. So, communication is something I bring up a lot on the podcast. I think it's really important. I might not be the most articulate person in the world, but I'm quite excitable and I'm quite excited, and I can get people to listen to me. When I start rolling, and I mean, you are just so articulate. Like you. I mean, had I been on your PhD committee, I would have been like, "This is a pass. You can leave and go to the real world now. You're good to go." The paper was written beautifully. It was so clear. There's plenty of, like, it did have the kind of classic reporting style of writing the findings in words and then putting the related statistics in parentheses. I'll be honest, I tend to just like skip the parenthetical comments because, like, I don't care that much when it's not exactly my research, but it flowed great. It was an awesome paper. The paper's been picked up by various news outlets. I found you on Silence Daily, but I saw that it seems to be, on several other news outlets. You're on this podcast, but you've obviously talked to other people about this paper as well. Do you have tips, thoughts on kind of how you've developed your communication style, what it's been like interacting with press or people who want to kind of interview about what you're doing?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for the lovely compliment.
Of course.
As a PhD researcher and as a psychology researcher, I think I always get in my head, and I think imposter syndrome is such a huge thing for me and for many of my peers. So it's very nice to have someone who's outside my field actually tell me, you know what, your writing is really clear and it's really easily understandable by someone who's not an expert in the field. So thank you. In terms of my communication and sort of written and verbal communication about my research, I think. In some aspects, it is the feedback from supervisors. So, like I mentioned, I am currently working with my supervisor from my master's, who went on to be my PhD supervisor, but also as early as my undergraduate research supervisor. She was really helpful and really brilliant in helping me just write in an eloquent way, and just having that practice and having that thorough feedback, I think, is really, really important. And yeah, I think just linking back to what you said very early on in the podcast of having a good team around you and having a good supervisor is actually much more important than the exact topic of the project. And you can get excited about things that you were previously less excited about if you've got a brilliant set of people around you and just people you can learn from. So I think that's one aspect of it. Um, I think I am quite a keen reader when I do have the time to read for fun. So I think just things like that could help. And I've always been more interested in the essay-based sort of subjects, but whilst also quite being interested in science. And I think bad science is such a pet peeve of mine, as you can tell by my sort of side monologue about open research. So I think that's part of it as well, and just trying to push myself to do things that are outside my comfort zone. So one thing I did last year was we had this public engagement opportunity to take part in a stand-up comedy night. And I'm not the most confident person, but I did it with one of my friends, and it was just talking about our research. Or in my case, it was more talking about open research. And just doing things that are more science communication and public facing rather than necessarily just within the research community, that can actually really help to develop your writing within research. So I've written some lay articles for the conversation, some blog posts. I've gone to a science festival recently where I interacted with school children and families talking about open research, and just learning to pitch your arguments at the right level can then feed back into your academic writing. And I think, yeah, my supervisor told me that from the beginning, that it's really important to get these different bits of experience when it comes to communication.
Yeah, I think that's all wonderful advice. To be honest, I might reach out and be, can we do a podcast on open research? Because that's something I'm very excited about. And you're obviously, your LinkedIn says that you're the chair of the Bath Open Research Group, which, you're obviously very committed to this, which is very important. But I think, yeah, that sort of practice, feedback, and trying different things in different areas. For me, I was fortunate that I've been in music for a really long time. I had to do like solo recitals as a kid and I hated them. It was always just this dreadful experience. But then I got to be in bands and, going up on stage, it's like, it was so fun because I was really enjoying it. Yeah, I wasn't the only person on stage, which was helpful, but it did kind of give me that sort of performance aspect where, yeah, I'll get a little bit nervous when I am first talking, but then I can walk in and just be like, you know, you guys have to listen to me for 10 minutes, so I might as well make this kind of entertaining for everyone involved. Um, so I know it's almost 5 p.m. your time on a Friday, so I won't hold you much longer. I do want to give a personal thank you for this research. I've done a couple of these interviews, these journal club articles so far. One was on Yellowstone because I'm really passionate about Yellowstone. One was about dogs and wolves because I have 2 dogs. I love dogs. Yours hit me because I have a late in life adult ADHD diagnosis. All right, my therapist kind of gently handed this idea to me a few years ago. I was like, no, that doesn't make any sense. That's not me. I'm just bad at focusing for 3 hours in a row. And then, over time, I sort of learned to accept it. And we did go through some, more formal testing and everything. But I, uh, I felt like it's sort of being handed a baby platypus, and you're like, I don't know if this is a mammal or a duck. I've heard that they have venom somewhere, and I'm not sure where. This is a very like, is it going to grow up and be my best friend, or is it going to grow up and kill me? I don't really know, So like having these frameworks, like I'm a very framework oriented person, hearing that there's these interventions. I work with a therapist who helps me with some more ADHD based interventions is really helpful and helps me give myself more grace. And I was super excited to be like, oh yeah, I do consider some of these things positive. Like I'm actually not really a hyper focused person. I am very, very scattered. I get like very micro hyper focuses and then I'm very startleable, but they don't last very long. But I use humor all the time. I'm moderately creative. These things that I can sort of be like, oh, okay, all right. And I do believe in, kind of more the placebo effect of things where now, yes, there's years perhaps of translating your research into clinical practice. But for me right now, I can kind of walk away and be like, yes, I am creative and that's awesome. Kind of like lean into the positives instead of being like, wow, it'd be really nice if I weren't so distractible. It'd be really nice if my brain weren't running so fast when I'm talking sometimes that I have to like restart a sentence because I just got completely jumbled up. It's like, no, doesn't matter. Focus on the positive. So that's my personal thank you for this research and your group's research. And then just to wrap it up, you're graduating fairly soon. Congratulations. Do you have a sense of what's next for you, career-wise, research-wise, or is it just you're figuring it out right now?
I am figuring it out right now, which is quite an uncomfortable situation to be in because myself as more of a planner. I like to have things planned out. If I go on holiday, I've got an itinerary. And I know that's not how life works. So at the moment, I'm trying to figure out what the next steps are for me. And I do definitely enjoy a lot of aspects of research, and I think research in ADHD is really exciting. So that would be something I'd be keen to continue. And yeah, especially because of things like what you said, you have such an impact on people's lives. It translates directly to people's everyday life. So that's really, really lovely about research in ADHD. But I'm not quite sure what is next, other than trying to wrap up all my current projects and yes, finish my PhD.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's everybody, not everybody, but many people's PhD's least favorite question. What are you doing next with your degree? But you're so passionate, you're so articulate, you have all these different branches, the open science, the research, the clinical work. Like you're going to find really cool things and do amazing things that is going to help the world. So I appreciate you and thank you for spending some time on your Friday afternoon with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. What a lovely, lovely interview. Again, thank you so much to Lutza, and best of luck in wrapping up your degree and all of the amazing things that would come up next. For this episode, I would say for me, my learn and move your feet, or that we heard a lot of things, we learned a lot of things. What's at least one takeaway we can try to implement right away this week, today, right after you finish listening to this, would be, how can you shift your framing around something that maybe right now you struggle with about yourself to something more positive? Maybe you have ADHD and you're like, yep, okay, I've been really irritated at myself. I'm always late to in-person meetings, or this thing always happens, or I always forget one item when I'm losing the house. How can you instead start viewing this aspect of yourself in a more positive light, right? Using those psychological strengths. And if you're not that familiar with psychological strengths, the internet is right there for you. Look it up. Let's dig in. Let's all figure it out together. I will link something in the show notes that I find really helpful around psychological strengths. As always, song of the week. This week, it's Bad Got Me Good by Jen Wigmore. Such a fun song. Has literally nothing to do with what we were talking about. I just was listening to it a lot today. I was like, yep, this is the one. Her voice is so cool. The song is really sassy. I love it. As usual, this podcast is not affiliated with my research and teaching roles at Colorado State University, but it's a part of my belief that we can and should all have jobs that we love. And specifically, these journal club episodes are part of my belief that research is really freaking exciting if you let it be, right? Like, it's so easy to get kind of dragged down into our own little field and feel kind of like, oh, I've read so many papers about this very niche thing that I do, and I'm bored. There's a whole world of really cool journal articles out there. And you can just go and you can find and you can read something random, and it may feel random, and there might be that little guilty voice in your head going, hey, you're wasting time right now. You should be working on your research. But you do not know what connection your amazing, smart, clever brain is going to make when you read something totally random that has nothing to do with what you've been working on all week, right? You might learn about a new technique that you can apply right to your work. You might learn about a new perspective, right? There's so many benefits from getting outside of our fields of expertise, even once a week, even once in a while. Just, look over the fence, see what else is going out there. I love these episodes. If you loved it too, you know how it goes. We work in a world of algorithms. If you share with a friend, you subscribe, you leave a review, all these things help. You click like, depending on whatever, platform you're listening on. All these things help other people find the episode. So I really, really appreciate it. Music is by XS Sass. You can follow me on Instagram at STEMdentity, and we will see you next week.